The only reason I woke up that Sunday morning to the sound of someone fiddling with my front doorknob was because the dog had already started howling like we were under siege. At first, I thought my neighbors were just being their usual weird selves, maybe kids playing a prank or the mail carrier getting a bit too curious about my Amazon packages. But there's a very specific sound that metal makes when it's forced into a lock that doesn't belong to it. It's that same hollow, scratchy scrape you hear in old movies, except when you hear it in real life at 7:18 a.m. in the suburbs, you don't think cat burglar. You think, great, what flavor of neighborhood drama am I in for this time? I tiptoed to the window, looked through the gap in the curtains, and nearly laughed out loud. There stood Karen from 3 houses down, clutching an oversized, brass, master key, like she was about to open the chamber of secrets. Her jaw was clenched in full determination, pastel blue suit already wrinkled, hair frizzed by the humidity, lips pressed together as if she was doing the community some heroic service. I watched her turn the key with more aggression than skill, muttering under her breath about unauthorized occupancy and association compliance. My hands shook, but only from suppressed laughter. There was something deeply surreal about watching a 40-something suburbanite, who once called the city on me because my mailbox was too artistic, attempt a home invasion with a prop straight out of a Scooby-Doo episode. I let her struggle for a solid minute, partly to see what she'd do next, partly because it was way too early to play hero. Finally, I walked to the door and calmly yanked it open. Karen's face went from victorious to slack-jawed horror in less than a second, like she'd just pulled off a mask and realized the villain was her all along. She stammered, hiding the key behind her back, as if that would somehow erase the last 5 minutes of illegal activity. "Can I help you, Karen?" I said, dry as dust. She straightened, did her best to muster dignity, and announced in her most official tone that she was conducting a surprise compliance check on behalf of the HOA board. She held up a clipboard covered in colored tabs and legalese, waving it like a talisman. According to Karen, my house had been flagged for unauthorized modifications and unregistered occupancy, something about a solar panel the board supposedly never approved, and an out-of-state visitor she claimed had been living in my guest room for weeks. I fought back a smirk, mostly because I just had the solar panel installed after getting written approval, and my only out-of-state visitor was a potted plant my sister forgot here in June. I looked at her, really looked, and saw what drove her. Not malice, but a deep-seated conviction that she alone was the last line of defense between order and chaos, one pastel suit at a time. Karen demanded to be let inside for a walk-through inspection, and when I laughed, she bristled like a cat. "This is a board matter," she hissed, ignoring the fact that the only thing official about her authority was the badge-shaped sticker on her clipboard. When I asked to see the written complaint or a warrant, she pivoted instantly to threats. "If you refuse, I'll be forced to call the authorities and file a non-compliance report. You do realize we can fine you daily, right?" Her voice climbed an octave as she sensed my utter lack of fear. She rattled off codes and penalties I was pretty sure she'd invented that morning, then tried to step past me. I blocked the doorway with my arm, pretending to yawn. That's when she produced the master key again, as if she'd forgotten I'd already seen it, and declared, "We can enter any property in the subdivision for inspection, per Section 12, subparagraph 4. There was something almost pitiable about the way she clung to her fantasy of authority, so desperate to be seen as the neighborhood's unsung hero. But the stakes didn't feel small anymore. A normal Sunday had turned into the opening act of a very public power play. So I took out my phone and hit record, speaking loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Karen, are you attempting to force entry into my house with a key that doesn't belong to you, on a claim you can't prove, without notice or a board vote?" She froze, eyes darting to the hedges where Mrs. Grady was already peering through her blinds, phone in hand. The confrontation had gone from sitcom to legal drama in less than 5 minutes, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in Karen's expression. Uncertainty, maybe even panic. Then she doubled down. She said she was calling the police, dialing the number with exaggerated calm, narrating every move into the phone as if she were on a reality show. Yes, officer, I need immediate assistance. Homeowner is obstructing an official HOA inspection, possibly harboring illegal tenants. Yes, I have the authority. Yes, I have the master key. I couldn't decide what was funnier. The fact that she actually said master key to a 911 dispatcher, or the prospect of real cops having to play referee to HOA politics. But she wasn't kidding. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car rolled up, lights off, 2 officers stepping onto the lawn, 1 male and 1 female, both looking like they regretted every career decision that led them here. Karen flagged them down, talking a mile a minute, brandishing the key like it was the sword in the stone. I kept my voice measured and cheerful, explained the situation, showed the officers my phone with the board's official email approving the solar panel, and pointed out the out-of-state guest, my sister's neglected ficus, sitting mournfully in the front window. The male officer actually had to cover his mouth to hide a smile. The female officer turned to Karen and asked for documentation authorizing entry. Karen waved her sticker-covered clipboard with a trembling hand, but couldn't produce anything official. No warrant, no signed complaint, nothing. I handed over my ID and deed to the property, freshly printed for just such a scenario, along with a thick folder of every email and approval I'd ever received from the HOA, complete with timestamps and signatures. The officers exchanged glances, the male one murmuring, "Seems pretty cut and dry to me." Karen, now red-faced, insisted that these people, meaning me apparently, were endangering the neighborhood by ignoring protocol. The cops gave her the polite but unmistakable look reserved for toddlers throwing tantrums. In the end, the officers suggested everyone go their separate ways and warned Karen to stay off my property unless she wanted to spend the afternoon at the station answering questions about attempted break-ins. She stormed off, still clutching the master key, muttering threats of board escalation and legal action as she stomped down the path. I watched her retreat, then turned to the officers and said, "She's going to come back, you know." The male cop grinned and said, "Just make sure your ficus doesn't file a complaint first." I shut the door behind me, adrenaline fading, and tried to laugh it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Karen wasn't going to let this go. For people like her, losing isn't an option, it's just the first act. And as I stood in my living room, listening to her distant voice rallying other neighbors on the sidewalk, I realized this war was just getting started. I thought I was ready for Karen's next move, but there's a special kind of madness that comes from a neighbor who's convinced she's the last line of defense between suburbia and anarchy. By Monday morning, the whole street felt different. It started with the little things. My mailbox was suddenly stuffed full of HOA pamphlets. 10, maybe 12 copies of the same rules I'd memorized years ago, each one with the violations section highlighted in neon marker. When I put them in the recycling, I noticed Karen herself standing at the corner, peering at me from behind her sunglasses. She had that phone in her hand again, talking in a stage whisper that carried all the way down the block. The rest of the neighbors kept their heads down. Some just wanted to avoid the drama. Others, the sort who liked HOA drama almost as much as Karen did, watched with open curiosity, probably hoping for fireworks. By noon, I got my first official email from the HOA board. It was a notice about alleged non-compliance events, citing reports of suspicious visitors, and unapproved landscaping modifications. I actually laughed when I read it. It was clearly written by Karen herself, based on the phrasing and the fact that it referenced my ficus as a potential long-term guest. I forwarded the email chain to the actual HOA president, Lisa, a retired school principal who, despite being about as fond of drama as she was of root canals, at least played by the book. Her reply was swift and to the point. "Ignore Karen, everything's approved, and for the love of all things holy, keep a paper trail." But Karen wasn't waiting for permission. The next escalation came that same afternoon. Around 3, I caught her and 2 of her usual cronies, Phil and Sherry, standing in a huddle outside my fence, tape measure in hand. Sherry wore her trademark visor and Phil had a GoPro strapped to his chest. Evidence collection, HOA style. I watched them from my upstairs window, amused at first, until Karen lifted the measuring tape to the edge of my flower bed, squinting at the numbers like she was cracking a case for Interpol. Every so often, she'd jot something on a clipboard. I knew what she was up to, collecting evidence for her next grand accusation. I debated going outside but decided to let her have her fun. The longer she stayed on the sidewalk, the less chance she had to break in again. That evening, I found a printed notice taped to my door. It was a final warning, in 32-point font, all caps, highlighted for emphasis. I was apparently in gross violation of Section 5, subclause whatever, and subject to immediate fines. The best part? She'd signed it Karen, acting board president. That was new. Karen wasn't the board president. Lisa was, and everyone knew it. So I took a photo of the notice, emailed it to Lisa, and went back to my dinner, but the game had changed. Now it was official. Karen wasn't just overstepping, she was fabricating authority, and there was no telling how far she'd go. Sure enough, the next morning Lisa called. She sounded exhausted, the way only someone can when she's spent all night fielding frantic phone calls. Karen had apparently gone door to door, whipping up the neighbors about an ongoing security crisis, pushing for an emergency board meeting to review homeowner conduct. Lisa reassured me she was handling it, but her voice betrayed a hint of worry. "Don't antagonize her," Lisa said. "Let me deal with the board. Just keep records and don't give her anything she can twist." By Thursday, the situation had become public spectacle. Karen distributed glossy flyers up and down the block with a photo of my house and a list of recent incidents, including late-night comings and goings, unauthorized window coverings, and my personal favorite, potentially hazardous flora. I couldn't decide if she meant the ficus or the new peonies. Every car that drove past seemed to slow down, drivers rubbernecking as if expecting the SWAT team to show up. My phone buzzed with texts from confused neighbors, some sympathetic, a few passive-aggressive, the rest just nosy. That afternoon, Lisa finally called an emergency HOA meeting to clear the air. The clubhouse was packed. Karen arrived first, clipboard and master key in hand, flanked by Phil and Sherry. I came in a few minutes later, calm and collected, with my folder of approvals, receipts, and emails, my armor in paper form. Lisa opened the meeting, setting the tone with her no-nonsense principal voice. She reminded everyone that the HOA had rules for a reason, and that false reports or unauthorized inspections could themselves be considered violations. Karen immediately took the floor, voice trembling with urgency. She recounted her version of events, my supposed noncompliance, the mystery guest in my house, the dangerous solar panel, and my ongoing resistance to official inspections. She waved the master key around as if it were a symbol of her sacred duty, glaring at anyone who dared to snicker. For a moment I almost admired her commitment. Then she dropped her bombshell. A stack of signed affidavits from neighbors who, she claimed, had witnessed my offenses. Most were just generic complaints about lawn length or trash can placement. One was from Phil, who'd apparently spotted unknown vehicles in my driveway, Amazon delivery, as it turned out. The room shifted uncomfortably. When Lisa asked to see Karen's authorization for entry, Karen doubled down. As acting president, I have the right to inspect any property at any time. Lisa calmly asked her when she'd been elected. Karen faltered, then stammered that she had the support of concerned residents. The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back piped up, "Lisa's the president, Karen." Another muttered, "You tried this last year." That's when I stood and addressed the room, projecting a serenity I absolutely did not feel. I recounted exactly what happened: the attempted break-in, the fake inspection, the master key, the call to police. I presented my folder of approvals and read aloud Lisa's email confirming everything. Then, for good measure, I handed out copies of Karen's bogus warnings, her flyers, and the supposed affidavits, including the one from my ficus, which I'd written myself as a joke and tucked into the pile for effect. The room erupted into laughter. Even Lisa cracked a smile. Phil and Sherry began to look less like deputies and more like accomplices who just realized their ringleader was in over her head. Lisa, reclaiming control, declared there would be no fines, no inspections without proper notice, and that any further attempts at vigilante enforcement would be referred directly to law enforcement. She looked right at Karen as she said it. Karen, red-faced and shaking, tried to speak, but her support was crumbling. The rest of the board backed Lisa, agreeing that Karen's actions were highly irregular and not remotely authorized. As I left the meeting, I caught sight of Karen storming out the side door, master key clutched in her fist, eyes glistening with frustration and something close to humiliation. For a moment I almost pitied her. But as I stepped out into the cool evening, I realized the war was far from over. Karen didn't know how to quit, and from the look on her face, she was about to escalate things to a whole new level. I'd barely made it back to my house before the emails started. Not from Karen, she was too rattled for that, but from other neighbors, most of whom I'd barely exchanged more than a wave with over the years. Some wrote to apologize for getting caught up in the drama. Others, sensing a neighborhood power shift, offered backhanded support, phrases like, "We all want what's best for the community," and "I hope things calm down soon." I saved every message, mostly because Lisa had drilled it into me. Paper trail, always. But the adrenaline from the HOA meeting was fading, replaced by a knot of unease. Karen had been humiliated publicly, and people like her didn't take defeat lying down. On Friday morning, the next phase of Karen's crusade became painfully clear. At exactly 7 a.m., as if she'd been lying in wait, a work crew arrived on my street. 3 men in neon vests unloaded ladders, a van marked HOA compliance inspections, and a stack of warning signs. Karen stood on the curb, arms folded, barking orders like a general. The lead worker, a guy named Eddie I recognized from local handyman gigs, looked vaguely apologetic as he approached my door. "Sorry, bud," he said, almost whispering, "but we've been told to inspect your property for violations. If we don't, Karen said she'll report us to the board for breach of contract." He showed me a copy of a work order, supposedly from the HOA, but the letterhead was clearly printed off a template, Neighborhood Homeowners Association, EST 1992, in Comic Sans. No official signatures, just acting president, Karen. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. But Eddie was stuck. Refusing would mean losing out on future business from the more Karen-aligned household. I told him to do what he needed to, as long as he stayed outside the property line, and made a point of filming the whole process. They spent the better part of an hour pacing the boundary, measuring my fence, and peering at my solar panel as if it might suddenly detonate. Meanwhile, Karen hovered behind them, scribbling furious notes and snapping photos with her phone, her expression a blend of triumph and simmering resentment. I called Lisa mid-morning, filling her in. She sounded genuinely alarmed, promising to handle it, but warned me to expect more nonsense. Karen had apparently called an emergency compliance committee without board approval and was making noise about taking action if the HOA wouldn't. Lisa, ever the diplomat, said she'd alert the real HOA attorney and urged me to document everything, no matter how ridiculous. I agreed, mostly for my own sanity, and set about compiling a digital dossier that could have put a petty tyrant on notice. Saturday dawned bright and peaceful, a sharp contrast to what was brewing under the surface. My mailbox was empty for once, but my security cameras caught Karen creeping through my front yard, peering into windows. She didn't knock or even leave a note, just prowled as if daring me to confront her. I watched her on my phone, equal parts annoyed and fascinated by her persistence. That afternoon, I noticed a strange car parked across from my house, a tan sedan I'd never seen before. It sat there for hours, engine idling, windows up. Finally, the driver stepped out, a man in a cheap suit, carrying a clipboard and a messenger bag. He strode up to my door, rapped once, and introduced himself as Mr. Halvorson, private investigator, retained by the HOA. He produced a business card. Real, but the ink was still tacky, like it had been printed last night. Ms. Karen has authorized a full review of your property, he said, almost apologetically. She believes there may be significant code violations, and has asked me to document evidence for potential legal action. I stared at him, then at the car, and realized Karen had actually spent her own money on a PI. Her own, since the HOA's budget didn't stretch to this kind of nonsense. I politely declined to answer questions, informed him he was trespassing, and reminded him that, unless he had a warrant or official court order, he could leave or enjoy a chat with local law enforcement. He blinked, hesitated, then asked if he could at least take a few photos from the sidewalk. I shrugged, then sat down on my porch steps, made sure my face was in every frame, and gave him a double thumbs up. After 10 awkward minutes, he left, muttering about overzealous clients. By now, the neighborhood grapevine was ablaze. Word spread fast that Karen had hired a detective, which somehow morphed into rumors of my involvement in everything from running a rental operation to housing criminal fugitives. The more ludicrous the rumors, the more the neighborhood seemed split between those who found it hilarious and those who avoided eye contact, afraid of getting dragged in. Phil and Sherry, ever the loyal sidekicks, started posting thinly veiled warnings on the neighborhood Facebook group, reminders about community safety and the importance of vigilance against noncompliance. That night, someone dumped a stack of anonymous flyers on my porch. Is our neighborhood safe? Across the top was a grainy, blown-up photo of my house, with arrows pointing to everything Karen had ever complained about: solar panel, mailbox, new paint on the shutters. Ask yourself, do you know your neighbors? I actually laughed out loud, but the truth was the tension was wearing on me. I started double-checking the locks, kept my phone nearby, and warned a couple of friendly neighbors to do the same. Lisa texted me late. I'm so sorry. She's out of control, but hang tight, tomorrow, we're having an emergency board vote. Her authority is getting stripped, for real. Sunday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation. I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps on my porch, and, for a wild second, wondered if Karen had graduated from PIs to process servers or worse. Instead, it was Lisa, along with 2 board members and a city police officer. This time, on official business. They'd come with documents in hand, ready to put the drama to bed. The board had reviewed every complaint, every phony affidavit, every evidence file Karen had compiled. They'd also collected statements from neighbors, work crew, and even poor Eddie the handyman. Lisa looked tired but resolute as she handed me an official HOA letter. Karen was hereby suspended from all board-related duties, pending review. All fines and citations against me were revoked, and further interference would be considered harassment, not compliance. The police officer, who looked like he'd drawn the short straw, warned me to call immediately if Karen showed up again. I thanked them, relief washing over me. The official weight of the board and law was finally on my side. But the final twist was still to come. Just as Lisa and the officer were leaving, Karen herself appeared at the end of my driveway, marching up with a box of files, clipboard wedged under one arm, and the infamous master key still dangling from her hand. She saw the officer, saw the documents, and froze. Then, for the first time since this whole fiasco began, her confidence wavered, just for a second. She stammered about appealing the decision, threatened to take it all the way to the county, and, in a last, desperate gesture, brandished the master key at Lisa and me as if it were some magical totem that could reverse her fate. The officer calmly stepped between us, asked Karen to return home, and reminded her that further attempts to enter my property would lead to legal consequences. She stormed off, but not before throwing the master key onto my lawn. It landed with a dull clang, a fitting symbol of her unraveling power. I picked it up, weighing it in my hand, and realized the war might be over, but Karen's need for control hadn't disappeared. It had only found a new battleground. Monday morning started with an eerie calm. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up to the rustle of pamphlets or the sound of Karen plodding outside my window. It was as if the entire neighborhood had hit pause after the showdown with Lisa, the HOA board, and the police. Even the dog sensed the change, curling up by the front door in uncharacteristic silence, no longer barking at every stray footstep. I made myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the master key lying next to the salt shaker, its presence more absurd than ever. I could have thrown it away, but something told me I hadn't seen the last of its magic. The emails from the weekend still lingered, and I could practically feel the neighborhood's collective breath being held, waiting to see what Karen would do next. Even Phil and Sherry, who had posted daily reminders about community values, were suddenly silent on the Facebook group. I almost felt sorry for them, almost. The power dynamic had shifted overnight, and no one knew what the new rules were yet. But I knew Karen. For her, losing wasn't defeat. It was an invitation to change the battlefield. Around noon, a city vehicle rolled up and parked in front of my house. A man in a crisp button-down, clipboard in hand, introduced himself as a municipal inspector. "Anonymous tip about unpermitted construction on the premises," he said, already looking weary, like he expected to find nothing. I gave him a tour of my backyard, pointed out the solar panel, fully permitted, paperwork ready, the garden shed, grandfathered in, and the peonies, possibly still under neighborhood suspicion. He took a few photos, nodded, and left with an apologetic smile. As he was pulling away, I spotted Karen across the street, watching through a narrow gap in her curtains. I raised my mug in a silent toast. She was down, but far from out. The day passed quietly, but late that afternoon, I heard raised voices down the block. I stepped outside to see Karen in full performance mode, standing on her own front lawn and addressing a small knot of neighbors. She waved the HOA bylaws over her head, shouting about the decay of community standards and the shocking lack of accountability in the current board. She warned of lawsuits, audits, a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Her audience looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet, eyes darting to their doorsteps. Only Phil and Sherry nodded in solidarity. The rest seemed to have finally realized just how deep in the weeds they'd followed her. I stood quietly at the edge of my driveway, watching. Karen's voice trembled, not with fear, but with desperation. She needed the crowd to believe in her power again. When she caught sight of me, her volume doubled, launching into wild accusations about unauthorized occupancy, illegal surveillance, and even slander. I didn't respond, didn't even smirk. Let her vent. Every word just dug the hole deeper. But as dusk settled, things took a darker turn. I got a text from Lisa. "Heads up, Karen filed a formal complaint with City Code Enforcement, claimed you threatened her with violence. Police may stop by." I almost laughed, but my stomach nodded all the same. This was her endgame. If she couldn't win through the HOA, she'd escalate it to real authorities, hoping to trip me up with enough paperwork and hassle that I'd cave. Sure enough, just after dark, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers approached, this time somber and official, no jokes or hidden smiles. They explained that Karen had accused me of harassment, trespassing, and intimidation. I handed over the same thick folder of emails, permits, and video footage, including a week's worth of security camera clips that showed Karen encroaching on my property and me never once approaching hers. The officers watched, nodded, and left, promising to follow up if anything else developed. The next morning brought the inevitable retaliation. City Code Enforcement parked out front again, this time to inspect for health code violations, after another anonymous tip. I greeted them with a fresh pot of coffee, joked about being their new regular stop. They laughed, inspected the ficus, the flower beds, even the mailbox, and found nothing. They left me with a warning, about Karen, not about my property. We see this more than you'd think, one of them said, glancing across the street. Neighborhood drama can spiral fast. But Karen's tactics weren't limited to bureaucracy. By midweek, a new kind of message appeared in the neighborhood Facebook group. Posts from newly created accounts calling out dangerous elements in the community and urging neighbors to report all suspicious activity. Some posts even linked to blurry photos of my house, taken at odd hours, with captions like, "Is this the new standard for our neighborhood?" The tone was anonymous but unmistakable. Lisa quickly deleted the posts and messaged me privately. "Don't engage. We're locking down the group until this blows over." I spent the next day trying to live my life as normally as possible, walking the dog, running errands, ignoring the way cars slowed as they passed my house. But the tension was building. That evening, I returned home to find my mailbox pried open, letters scattered across the porch. I checked the security footage, but the camera had mysteriously cut out for 10 minutes. Sabotage? Maybe. Or maybe the wind or a raccoon. But I wasn't about to let paranoia win. So I played my own game. I wrote a friendly, sarcastic letter addressed to the neighborhood, printed a dozen copies, and posted them on the community notice board and slipped them under doors. In it, I recounted the absurdity of recent events, highlighting the ficus, the master key, the dangerous peonies, and my supposed reign of terror, then closed by inviting anyone with genuine concerns to come over for coffee and a look at the real house, not the Karen-inspired fantasy. I ended with, "Let's remember we're neighbors, not contestants on a reality show. My door is open, unless you're breaking in with a master key." The next day, to my surprise, 2 neighbors did come by. They apologized for believing rumors and admitted they were tired of the drama. Word spread. By the end of the week, several other neighbors approached me with similar confessions. Lisa stopped by to say she'd received a wave of messages asking the board to formally censure Karen for harassment. She showed me a petition with more than a dozen signatures, enough to trigger an official recall vote. I thanked her, but I wasn't celebrating yet. Karen was quiet, too quiet. Friday evening, as the sun was setting, I spotted her standing alone at the far end of her driveway, talking into her phone. She looked smaller than usual, shoulders hunched, clutching a stack of paperwork that drooped like wilted flowers. Her bluster was gone. I watched her watch me, and for a second, we locked eyes across the street. There was something raw in her expression. Rage, yes, but also loss, bewilderment, a kind of grief for the authority she'd built her identity on and now couldn't reclaim. She turned away and disappeared into her house. The next morning, a new notice was taped to every mailbox on the street. Emergency HOA meeting, recall vote. It was official. Karen's reign was on the chopping block, her power reduced to the thinnest thread. Saturday morning arrived with a tension so thick you could taste it in the air. It was recall day, and for the first time in years, everyone in the subdivision seemed to have urgent business outside at the same hour. Lawn mowers hummed, sprinklers clicked, but underneath it all was an undercurrent of anticipation, like the whole neighborhood was collectively holding its breath. Even the kids felt it, riding bikes in slow circles as their parents whispered on driveways. I watched from my kitchen window, sipping coffee and occasionally glancing at the master key still resting in the fruit bowl, now more neighborhood legend than threat. It gleamed in the morning sun, a reminder that sometimes the things that symbolize control are just brass and bluster after all. By 10, people began trickling toward the HOA clubhouse. Some carried paperwork, others just brought coffee and nervous laughter. Lisa stood near the entrance with a sign-in sheet, greeting each resident with the weary grace of someone who had spent her week herding cats, and Karen. Even Phil and Sherry showed up, though they hovered near the back, talking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. I walked in, folder in hand, calm and unbothered on the outside, though inside I was already rehearsing what I'd say if Karen tried anything dramatic. Karen arrived last. She wore her best powder blue suit, pearls at her neck, hair shellacked into submission. She looked tired, but the old fire still flickered in her eyes. She clutched a stack of printouts, HOA bylaws, her infamous affidavits, and what looked like a last-minute speech. For a moment, she paused at the doorway, surveying the room as if still searching for pockets of support. When she spotted me, she hesitated, her expression a tight knot of resentment and wounded pride. Lisa called the meeting to order. Her voice was calm but firm, slicing through the room's anxious energy. She explained the agenda and why they were gathered: recent incidents, board misconduct, and the need for a recall vote. Karen tried to interject, but Lisa, backed by the majority of the board, insisted that the process be followed without interruption. The floor opened to community comment. A few neighbors spoke up, describing months of petty warnings, false citations, and the toxic atmosphere that had settled over the block. Someone recounted the day the police arrived for a compliance inspection, shaking their head at the absurdity of it all. Another neighbor, Mrs. Grady, read aloud from one of Karen's flyers and, to everyone's surprise, apologized to me for believing it. "We lost sight of what matters," she said, voice trembling. "We let fear win. I'm sorry." It was Karen's turn. She stood, smoothed her suit, and launched into her defense. She spoke of tradition, of responsibility, of how hard she'd worked to keep the neighborhood safe and up to standard. She tried to paint herself as the misunderstood guardian, the only one willing to do what was necessary. But her voice wavered. For the first time, her words sounded hollow, as if even she didn't quite believe them anymore. When she waved the stack of bylaws, a couple of people actually laughed. Phil and Sherry looked down at their hands, embarrassed. Karen saw it too. The isolation in her eyes was unmistakable, a once unshakable leader, now reduced to someone pleading not to be left behind. Lisa read the results of the official review. Karen had acted far outside her authority, forged signatures, and filed fraudulent complaints. The documentation was clear and the city's investigations had all exonerated me. The vote began. Ballots went out row by row, and the silence that fell was almost reverent. Lisa and another board member counted the slips at the front of the room while everyone watched. When the tally was done, Lisa announced the outcome. By a landslide, Karen was recalled as a board member and stripped of any remaining HOA authority. She was barred from holding office for at least 5 years, with an official warning placed in the record. There was a stunned silence. Then, slowly, people began to clap. It wasn't a victory lap or a celebration of someone's downfall. It was relief, a communal exhale, the sound of a burden lifting. Karen stood perfectly still, face pale, lips pressed so tight they almost vanished. For a moment I thought she'd unleash another tirade. But instead, she gathered her papers, looked out at the crowd, and simply said, "You'll regret this." Her voice cracked, not with anger but with something softer. She left the room without another word. I felt a pang of something like sympathy, even after all she'd put me through. The crowd watched her go, then seemed to collectively turn the page. After the meeting, neighbors milled around outside, chatting more openly than I'd seen in years. A few came over to shake my hand or thank me for standing up for sanity. Lisa stopped by, relief etched on her face. "It's over," she said, then added with a wry grin, "at least until the next person decides to weaponize the flower beds." We laughed, and for the first time in a long while, it felt genuine. I walked home through the sunshine, the master key cool and heavy in my pocket. But the story wasn't quite finished. That evening, as I was putting out the recycling, I found Karen sitting on the curb outside her house, staring into the distance. She looked smaller without the aura of power, just a neighbor now, no longer the villain. On impulse, I walked over and handed her the master key. She stared at it, blinking, then let out a shaky laugh. "Guess it never opened much of anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, I really thought I was helping." I shrugged, not unkindly. "Maybe next time, try knocking." For a second, we sat there in silence, just two people at the end of a long, ridiculous war. She nodded, clutching the useless key. When I left, she was still sitting there, looking at it, as if trying to understand what had really been lost. The weeks that followed felt lighter. The neighborhood slowly mended. People started chatting over fences again, sharing coffee, helping with yard work. Lisa led the board with new transparency, and I finally felt like my house was my own again. Not a battlefield, just a home. Sometimes I'd spot Karen in her garden, a little quieter, a little lonelier, but not quite so fearsome. The master key never appeared again. Maybe she'd kept it as a reminder, or maybe she'd finally let go. If you ask anyone on our street now, they'll say it was a wild chapter, but that it made us stronger. Neighbors instead of enemies, a community instead of a war zone. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best defense isn't walls or paperwork, but stubborn calm and a little humor, even in the face of absurdity. That, and always keep a copy of your permits handy. Just in case the next master key shows up on your doorstep.